She presses her forehead to the cold, chipped counter and says it like a confession or a dare. I haven't let anyone touch me in months. Matteo Rinaldi's coffee goes untouched in his hands. There is a sudden, ridiculous lightness in the diner. The fluorescent bulbs hum, a spoon clinks against ceramic, while outside, the city breathes hot and dangerous through the cracked window. Marina's voice is small and raw, and for a breath, Matteo is a man who only hears the fracture beneath a sentence, not the name that should have made the room tilt. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. He masks the way his jaw tightens with the even, practiced neutrality of a man who has trained his face into an anonymous fixture. Customers come and go from the shuttered night diner. Truck drivers with tired eyes, kids from the corner gambling on small futures. A cop who reads the paper as if the world outside can be understood in headlines. No one acknowledges Matteo Rinaldi. That is the currency he buys. Invisibility dressed as a plain shirt, a crumpled newspaper, the worn seat by the window. But Marina's whisper is an unpaid debt. It travels through him like cold water. "You mean that?" he asks. His voice is low, not a threat. Dangerous men do not usually need to talk themselves down to gentleness, but there is gentleness in the baritone that takes the edge off his power. A sound that could have soothed a child or a soldier. An old habit of a man who has smoothed foreheads and signed fates. Marina keeps her eyes on the counter. Her knuckles, calloused from years of lifting plates, rest on the enamel like punctuation. "Months," she repeats. Since before Luca got involved." Her mouth tightens at her brother's name. Saying it aloud is like opening a door and expecting monsters to step through. Matteo watches her as if he can read all the pages written under her skin. He has been watching this block for years, measuring the cadence of fear the city lends to those who keep their heads down. Tonight, he is supposed to be a customer, one of his own rules, and yet he is a man following a single thread he cannot ignore. He has seen the way Marina moves through the diner, the cautious generosity to patrons who could harm her, the way she counts change like a litany, the careful placement of every cup as if the world might tilt if one plate clanks wrong. There is a steadiness that belongs to survivors. "You don't have to tell me why," he says, but he leaves the sentence open. In the silence that follows, the city's noise presses in. A siren on the far avenue, a car horn, distant laughter that smells of neon and trouble. Marina laughs, a wet, sharp sound that is half scoff, half surrender. "You don't know anything about me," she says, though her voice lacks conviction. The diner ceiling fan sways, carving shadows across their faces. Matteo understands exactly. He knows about the Rinaldi territory 2 blocks south, the recent pressure from a younger crew pushing to carve out a patch of the neighborhood. He knows the list of debts that get traded like baseball cards between dealers, and the way a man's name can be a menace on a scrap of paper. He needs nothing from her but information rarely offered to strangers, the map of a human who moves between the cracks. "Then tell me when to leave," he says. "I don't want to be a complication." Marina's laugh is a thin thing. "Too late," she says. "You're already a complication." Her fingers twist the hem of her apron. "You could make them stop." He can. Matteo could make the young runners vanish, or he could flatten them until their names are only a cautionary scribble on someone's notebook. He has the reach, the men, the patience for violent arbitration. He also has a ledger of favors, a history that reads like a ledger of sins. Offering protection is never neutral. It exchanges the shape of danger for the shape of obligation. He watches her mouth move with the economy of someone used to summoning strength from the bottom of an empty cup. "What do you want?" he asks. Marina's eyes flick up. For a moment, they are innocent and jagged at the same time, like glass polished by rain. "I want Luca away from Tino's crew," she says. "I want them to stop hanging around the alley behind the diner. I want the threats to stop. I want a life where I don't have to watch my back." It could be pride that makes her not say she can pay. Or it could be that there is nothing left in her pockets beyond love and old debts. Matteo's offer will not come from charity. Nothing he gives is free. But he recognizes leverage, and worse, he recognizes need. The corner where she stands is a crucible. He could either close his fist and command safety, or he could extend a hand that will change both of them. "I can make them stop," he says, "but protection comes with strings." She looks at him, and he sees the way her pupils dilate, not from the threat, but from the calculation. Survivors trade pieces of themselves to survive. Marina is no exception. "What are your strings?" she asks. "Small ones," Matteo says, and smiles with a mouth that has been accused of many things and has rarely used tenderness as a weapon. "You keep your diner safe. You give me a place to watch from. You let me know if anything moves against the Rinaldi-claimed streets. You tell me who's paying whom and when the police stop by. Nothing personal, business." "That's all," she says, skepticism cutting her tone like a knife. It is a bargain in small letters, loyalty for loyalty, favors for favors. But in the margins, there is space for what can't be written. A warmth in Matteo that complicates the ledger. He stands up, leaves a bill under his coffee cup, and gestures to the worn counter. "You can start tonight," he says. Her agreement is reluctant. It is also relieved. The weight of a promise lands on her shoulders with the subtle thud of survival. She nods and returns to the back of the diner, where the coffee steams and the neon sign buzzes with promises that never materialized. Matteo watches her for a long moment, feeling something that could be interest or hunger or pity. He tells himself he is not there because of her body, not because he has read the whispered rumor that she keeps herself guarded, but because she is a useful node between him and the neighborhood. Men like Matteo cultivate utility, and loyalty is inefficiency. But if he has been mistaken in everything else, he knows the tilt of a life attempting to stand again. He has smoothed the grieving mother's hair while telling his lieutenants to deliver blows. He has learned the arithmetic of risk and the currency of devotion. Protecting Marina will be a ledger entry. It will also be the first time lately he has offered shelter without immediately calculating how to exploit it. The next morning, a boy from Tino's crew shows up to test the diner's resolve. He leans against the jukebox and orders a coffee with a sneer, his voice dripping entitlement. Marina answers with measured politeness. She has learned that a plate can be a shield and a smile a small truce. The boy's friends hover in the doorway. He demands rent for using their block, talking like a man who believes in the right of the loudest voice. Marina refuses quietly. The boy laughs and says a name, Luca, like the final punctuation. Matteo is there at dusk, as if drafts have been arranged. He watches the confrontation with a steady hand in his coat. He steps into the light when the boy gets bold, and his movement is a ripple that silences the room. The boy straightens, his bravado dissolving when the name on Matteo's lips becomes a warning. "You don't take from mine," Matteo tells him. His voice is a rasp of glaciers and gunmetal. The boy stumbles into an apology. He has never been in the presence of someone whose absence would cause more harm than his continued noise. The boy backs down. The crew disperses. The diner hums back to its ordinary nervous life. For Marina, the taste of relief is metallic and unfamiliar. She thanks Matteo, and the words come out clumsy as if she is not used to gratitude that arrives without coercion. He answers with a look that is not his usual math. It is a rare, almost private softness that hints at the late nights he has spent with grief and regret, smoothing the edges of a life he cannot fully redeem. They settle into a fragile rhythm. Mateo, the shadow who arrives and leaves like tide, and Marina, the woman who guards her body as if withholding touch will hold death at bay. He asks about Luca with the careful focus of a man cataloging risk, while she answers with a protective ferocity that surprises even her. There are no promises beyond the night's safety, but proximity rewrites certain rules. A hand lingers over a coffee cup a moment too long. A look lasts a fraction more than decorum should allow. None of this is innocent. Each shared breath, each small kindness, is ledgered somewhere in the underworld Mateo navigates. Capos notice who he favors. Tenentes take the measure of whose protection can be bought. The city's corrupt arteries begin to feel the pulse of a new pattern. Mateo shielding a small, stubborn diner where a woman refuses to be touched. Rumors travel like smoke, a boss softening, a woman keeping secrets. For Marina, the rumor is a dangerous ornament. For Mateo, it is an unfamiliar ache that threatens to bend the rules he has lived by without regret. That first act closes on a simple, sharp dilemma. Protection is offered, but with invisible cost. Marina has taken the shelter she needs to keep Luca alive, but her acceptance ties her to a man whose hands have ordered both mercy and massacre. Mateo has offered security, but the favor leaves him exposed, not only to rival houses who will see a weakening, but to the unfamiliar threat of needing someone who is not an asset but a person. Between them grows an unnamed thing, desire that neither can confess without worrying that to speak it aloud could break the fragile truce they have just begun to rely on. The city keeps its codes, but their bargain has already rewritten a few lines, and the next chapter promises to test how much each is willing to lose to keep what they thought they had bought. Mateo's hand hovered over the sugar jar, then withdrew as if the air itself might burn him. He'd carved careful habits from a life he couldn't unmake. No reaching for what wasn't offered, no crossing private borders without consent. And still, the simple geometry of his restraint felt like punishment. Marina wiped down the counter with a practiced rhythm, her movements a choreography of distance. The diner smelled of frying oil, lemon cleaner, and the faint musk of someone who sleeps with one ear to the door. They moved in the same room, two magnets cautious, charged. "You don't have to sleep here," Mateo said quietly the first night he offered her an escort home. The street outside had teeth, a row of broken streetlights, shadows that leaned like men waiting for favors. She shook her head, apron still tied, her keys clenched like talismans. "I know the back alleys. I know when things shift," she replied, and it was both true and a shield. She meant to say she didn't want obligations tracing her steps, didn't want fingers tied by favors she hadn't consented to. Mateo watched her shoulders, how they never quite relaxed even when the crisis was over. He wanted to tell her he could keep his distance. He also wanted, with a weight he hadn't felt since his wife, to press gentleness into an architecture that had built itself from fear. They began a ritual. He would appear as the day thinned, a presence that could not be named in photographs or gossip because he was a rumor wrapped in a suit. He paid the boys who hung out by the alley an addition to the rent, money delivered with a softness that made them suspicious and obedient. He gave the diner a new fryer on credit through an associate who looked askance at how quickly Mateo moved. Small salvations. He never touched Marina. He stepped around her like a penitent, hoping not to stain a saint. It felt like a kindness until it didn't. The first fissure arrived in the form of a question from Luca. He was youth and need bundled into a wiry frame. a younger mirror of Marina's fierce loyalty. When the older runners started pressing harder, when the names the boys chanted at dusk became promises of control, Luca folded himself into Marina's life like a soft armor. He wanted to pay back what she had borrowed in stolen cigarettes and half-truths. He wanted to be a man who could stand when the world tested him. He listened to Matteo as if the man's words were carved in stone, and wanted to replicate the tone, the way power was asserted like a fact. "It's yours now," Luca announced one night, when Matteo had left and the diner hummed with a tiredness pre-dawn gave to places that had no other claim. "He's giving us protection. He's on our side." Marina's hand stilled on the coffee pot. For a second, she forgot the precise way to tilt to pour without spilling, and a hot ring clung to her palm. "He's not ours," she said sharply. Her voice folded and then grew hard. "He protects what's his." Luca, with an infuriating sincerity, bristled. "He helped us tonight." He warned them off. Matteo's help had been a blunt instrument, a clear line drawn between the diner and whoever thought they could rent their intimidation. But to Luca it read like recruitment. Marina saw the dangerous light in her brother's eyes, ambition carved by survival, and she felt it as a rebuke. "You don't get to be his joke," she said. "You don't get to think he's here to make you into something else. You don't barter your life for a title." Her words were meant to protect Luca from himself and to put distance between her and the closeness Matteo's presence was beginning to invite. In the weeks that followed, Luca tried to repay in ways that Marina's skin go taut. He ran small errands for Matteo's men, fetching a package here, pushing a car there, believing he was carving a place for himself. Each small favor bound him to people who valued leverage at the expense of humanity. Marina watched it happen and fought against the tides she had invited. She had asked for protection, she had not expected it to come with apprentices. Matteo, who understood how alliances calcified into expectations, tried to keep Luca at arm's length. He assigned the boy menial errands that were meant to occupy and not to bind, taking a message across town, delivering fruit to an old capo's mother, learning the code of favors without enacting the terrible ones. But the underworld is porous. Tenentes noted a young man's face in Matteo's wake and filed it away as potential leverage. Matteo's generosity to the diner now read in some circles as favoritism, an opening to pry at. The real test, the thing that began to eat at the seam between them, wasn't the men outside or the ledger entries, though both haunted the margins. It was the small violences of a protector's certainty. The first time Matteo's voice turned towards command was under the fluorescence, a whisper that laced itself with intention. "You shouldn't walk back from your brother's practice," he said one evening when Marina refused to let Luca take a job that would have made him disappear to a corner of the city where favors were traded for bones. "You should let my men take him." His suggestion was baseless practicality to him. He had men, they were trained to look after people and to enforce rules without sentimental cost. To Marina, it felt like theft. Her role, her agency, her ability to decide her brother's path was being bartered to the highest bidder who could promise no immediate harm. She bristled not because she didn't see the logic, but because logic felt like a tool to take what she still had left. "He's my brother," she said. "You're not his father." Matteo's jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm trying to keep him alive." "You keep him alive by leaving us breathing the right way," Marina shot back, the words sharper than she intended. She hated that the man who'd offered an out for Luca's immediate danger was also reframing the contract into a custodianship she hadn't agreed to. The diner, once a plain battlefield of coffee and change, morphed into a theater where power played out in the smallest gestures. Matteo began to expect certain things: information, loyalty, adherence to rules he didn't codify but assumed would be obeyed. Marina, who had surrendered to a desperate bargain for safety, realized she had not signed up for the policing of her life. The thing she feared most, the world using her fragility as the coin to be traded, had returned in a different shape. Not the blunt violence of threats outside, but the slow smother of benevolent control. That suffocation put desire under pressure. Nights when Mateo lingered longer than necessary at the diner counter, when a music of unspoken apologies played in his chest, Marina felt the rhythm of something dangerous. His presence moved from being a shield to an authority, and the authority made her recoil. She found herself cataloging every kindness as a claim. If he bought a new heater because winter could kill, what did that purchase own? If he told Luca to avoid a corner and Luca listened, who decided who lived? Mateo, for his part, battled a strange new vulnerability. There were nights when he watched Marina from a far booth and wanted nothing so much as to reach across and lay a hand on the back of her neck, to press a palm to the place where worry lived, and to smooth it as he had smoothed the brow of grieving women in his past. He could give her security with a nod. He couldn't, with a nod, erase the memory of why she would rather make her body a fortress than an offering. His power made him dangerous, he knew. His tenderness made him a traitor to his own code. The two selves warred quietly. The city, as cities do, forced the issue. A small, visible outrage landed on the diner's stoop one rain-soaked morning. A detective with slick hair and a laugh like cracked glass began to ask questions too pointed for everyday curiosity. He'd been seen taking Mateo's men's coffee, smiling at the wrong corners. His presence meant more than surveillance. It meant a ledger being checked. He wanted names, and he wanted them wrapped in exchange. He came with a badge, and with the badge came the insinuation, "Tell me what you know, and I'll look the other way." Marina recognized his game. He slipped into the diner and sat with the pretension of ownership, and while Mateo was at his usual booth, late and far, he shot comments that were mostly salivate and mostly threat. "You're cozy with him," the cop said to Marina at one point, as if intimacy could be proven by the angle of a smile. "You know who comes through here. You can make life easier for some people." Marina heard Luca swallowing in the kitchen. She saw the way the cop's eyes tracked Mateo's table and then back to hers, as if to triangulate a bargain. It stung, because she wanted to protect Luca without being reduced to a bargaining chip. She wanted to survive without being reduced to a ledger entry. She told the cop nothing. She smiled a smile that had the years of practice in it and handed him coffee. The cop left, irritated but empty-handed. Mateo, however, did not. He watched the man leave and then sat in silence until the last customer was gone. When he came to the counter, his voice no longer a suggestion but a demand, he said, "If they come again, tell me." Marina's reply was a single, exhausted exhale. "I will." In that exchange, power calcified into expectation. Mateo had asked, and Marina had agreed, because how could she not? The city was a place where silence and cooperation were often the difference between dinner and death. But the bargain left a taste like pennies in her mouth. She had accepted safety. She had not accepted being surveilled by the person who granted it. The tension between them reached a public crease the night Mateo's men, acting on a vague tip, swept the alley behind the diner. They found Luca where he shouldn't have been, too close to a crew they weren't supposed to be near. The men took him in for questioning, 2 hours in a corner room, firm hands and quieter threats, and returned him with instructions and a wound that ran deeper than skin. Marina watched the exchange with a collapse in her chest. The men claimed they had acted to protect. Luca's lip trembled in a way that said he felt owned, and Marina felt the ownership like a lash. She knew well how favors calcified into authority when intentions were left unvoiced. Mateo had protected by policing. He had protected by taking the agency from those he meant to save.
She confronted him that night, the diner closed, the neon sign buzzing like a tired animal. He stood in the doorway with his coat on, the light catching at the angles of his face. For a moment, the two of them were only silhouettes, and Marina felt small and furious all at once. "You put your men on him," she said. The words weren't a question. Mateo's expression closed. "I watched him," he said. "I kept him from being deeper in. You asked me to protect him." "I didn't ask you to make him yours," she snapped. "I asked for them to stop hassling us. I didn't ask for this." Her voice broke on the last word. "He's 16. He's still my brother." He looked at her then. All the years of his life folded in that look. The men he'd lost, the woman he'd loved until illness took her, the children he'd watched be born, and the funerals he'd orchestrated. He heard the accusation and the plea in her tone. He weighed against his conviction that his way was the fastest path to keeping people alive. "I thought I was doing what you wanted," he said, softer than she expected. "I thought I was keeping him safe." "And you thought taking him out of his life was safety," she countered. "You don't get to decide where his life goes." They stood in a silence that hummed like a wire. Outside, the city kept its rhythms. Cabs, a siren, the distant slam of a door. But inside the diner, the air was dense with something dangerous. The knowledge that a man with power had taken liberties she had not consented to, and the sick, desperate gratitude that had made her accept his help in the first place. Mateo reached for the sugar jar, and this time he didn't withdraw. His fingers closed around ceramic with the tentative, careful motion of someone trying not to break what he held. He wanted to reach further. He wanted to reach to the part of Marina that kept herself a fortress and lightly lay a hand there, to prove with touch that protection could be gentle. But he stopped himself, because he had vowed, wordlessly, to respect her walls. "What do you want me to do?" he asked instead, a question that was both practical and an apology. Marina's eyes glimmered. "I want Luca to decide," she said. "No more handing him off his payment, no more turning him into leverage. If you want our loyalty, it doesn't have to be bought with him." He considered, and in that consideration he felt the pull of his world. Men who saw concession as weakness, the tenentes who would pounce on any sign of a softened jaw. Yet he also felt, for the first time in a long time, the cost of what he built. He could make the city safe by crushing the opposition, by exacting a price that would settle questions for a decade. Or he could let a small, stubborn thing, mercy, rewrite one ledger. The choices he made would ripple. He counted the cost of each. "I will keep them off his back," he said finally. "No more men detaining him. I'll talk to my people. But you have to tell me when they show up. You have to be the one to call." "You want me to be your eyes?" Her laugh was bitter. "And when I tell you, what then? You come with a gun and a memory that this is all yours?" "No." His voice was a slow burn. "I come to take the threat away. I come to make sure the boys understand the boundaries, and I try not to take anything else." It was not a full surrender. It was not redemption. It was, at best, a truce with a map of landmines. Marina agreed because she had always agreed in the face of fear, because Luca's life mattered more than any principle she could afford to keep. Mateo began to give orders to his men that were both protective and freeing. "Stay away from Luca. Don't recruit him. Don't take him in for questioning unless I say so." It solved some problems and created others. They slept with new rules on their shoulders. Power settled into roles that left them both raw. Marina guilty for accepting help that had curdled into possession. Mateo guilty for exerting a control he'd convinced himself was mercy. The delicious tension between them, a bloom of something neither dared name, kept flowering into darker petals. Every time Mateo restrained a hand from touching her, his restraint felt like a confession. Every time Marina kept her body walled, it felt like both defense and a rebuke. And under both their skins, a realization grew like a bruise. Protection and possession were not the same, yet the line between them was as thin as a hair. Their bargain had bought safety, yes, but the price tags were still being counted, and neither could say for sure which currency they would have spent to keep what they had gained. The confession landed like a stone through glass. "You never said you talked to anyone," Mateo said. He stood in the doorway of the diner with the rain still beating on his coat, and the fluorescent light painted him like a memory she could not look away from. His voice had the brittle quality of someone who had been surprised by tenderness and punished for it. "You never said you were giving them names." Marina tasted iron. For a heartbeat, she imagined the world flipping into the ledger he lived by. Names, dates, consequences. She had rehearsed 1,000 refusals in the back of nights when fear scraped against the edges of sleep. She had not rehearsed the look in his eyes that night, the way disappointment creased a man who had never expected to be disappointed by something small and human. "I wasn't giving them names to hurt you," she whispered. "I was trying to stop something worse." Mateo's hand seized the edge of the counter as if the ceramic could tether him to reason. Worse for whom? For Luca. The words came out jagged. She set her palms flat, as if steadying herself against more than just the countertop. "There's a woman, Vera Mariani. She lost her brother to a Rinaldi hit last year. She's been trying to gather anything to bring you down. She thinks if she gets enough dirt, she can make you bleed in court. She came to me because she knew I saw things." Mateo's laugh was sudden and empty, like wind moving through empty rooms. "Vera Mariani," he repeated. The name on 100 police notebooks. A woman who had the appetite for retribution and the patience to poison an empire with whispers. "You spoke to her?" "She asked questions," Marina said. She stopped. There was a migratory quality to her words now, as if fear had rearranged the furniture of her memory. She asked about where shipments moved, about times the Rinaldi cars were in and out. I told her things she already knew, or things that felt small. I tried to lead her to paper, not men. I thought if I fed her scraps, she'd leave Luca alone. Mateo's jaw worked. The room seemed to tilt into a narrower dimension. He had built shadows for a lifetime and prided himself on understanding who was shadow and who light. For the first time in a long time, the arithmetic of his dominion failed him. She had not lied in the brutal, obvious sense. She had withheld the full ledger. She had traded whispers for the fragile hope of redirecting a weapon. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was not loud. It was only a blade held close. "When you were in danger, when your brother was, why not tell me and let me handle her?" "Because I thought I could do it myself," Marina said. And for the first time in the months since Mateo had arrived, she allowed herself to sound small. "Because I thought I could keep Luca off of any ledger. Because I was ashamed." Her hands trembled. "I thought if I gave her scraps, she'd be satisfied. I thought I could bargain with hope." Vera Mariani's name put dust in Mateo's mouth. He saw the maps in his head, who owed what to whom, and who kept records of vengeance like prayer books. Vera did not take scraps. She built arsenals from crumbs. The idea that Marina, a woman with a history of protecting herself by silence, had stepped into a net of her own making was more infuriating than any direct defiance. It was proof that fear could rearrange the bravest souls into instruments. "You fed her crumbs," he said, "and now she wants the whole bakery." She doesn't know everything, Marina pleaded. She thinks she does because she's desperate. I never gave her names. I never told her about the shipments. I told her times and streets. Nothing that could be traced to you. I was trying to be smart. Mateo's eyes shaded with something like sorrow. You don't barter with people who keep score by blood, he said. Even crumbs add up. Outside, a car door slammed, a world unknowable and indifferent to the small domestic catastrophes that played inside the diner. Mateo took a step forward, then another, and the space between them contracted until it felt like wire. He wanted, impossibly, to reach out and gather her into a fold of protection so physical it would erase the treachery of the night. Instead, he stepped back. It was a gesture of restraint and of punishment at once. We're on different sides of the ledger now, he said. If Vera gets anything she can use, if she plants something in a file, if she shows up with a detective and a warrant, this doesn't end with a conversation. People will die, Marina. People who trust me. People I keep alive for reasons that aren't yours. She swallowed, the sentence hollowing him out like a confession. I know what your world costs, she said. I know you can be brutal. I didn't mean. Intentions don't count, he snapped. Outcomes do. The sharpness of it split the diner into two cold halves. Luca, who had been standing at the window trying to look useful and invisible at once, retreated into the kitchen like a man ducking from a storm. He had overheard enough to know his life could be purchased and sold. Marina watched her brother fold himself smaller, and guilt tasted like rust. The next days became an erosion. Vera's hunger grew. She began showing up at corners outside the diner, her eyes like searching instruments. She left flyers on car windshields with Mateo's name and a litany of allegations. She made anonymous calls to newspapers hinting at hidden accounts and off-the-books deals. The detective, slick-haired, glassy-jawed, grew bolder, aligning his questions with Vera's narrative. Each appearance gnawed at Mateo's patience and sharpened his men's resolve into paranoia. Worse, a whisper arrived in the form of a man called Carlo, the lieutenant Mateo had once trusted like blood. Carlo approached in a way that smelt faintly of old alliances being recalculated. He referenced Mateo's late wife in the manner of a man checking a ledger, sentiment as currency. He praised Mateo's restraint and suggested, softly, that a boss who showed softness where a knife was required risked everything he'd built. "You're making moves," Carlo said one humid night in the back room of a bar that smelled of spilled bourbon and unfinished oaths. "You're letting a woman make claims on the edges of our map. Sides are talking. Tenentes are wondering if Rinaldi's heart has softened." Mateo's hands curled into fists at his sides. Carlo's implication was both a warning and an offer. The underworld smelled power and rewarded those who sniffed out weakness. If Mateo was perceived as lenient, challengers would be emboldened. "I'm not trying to be soft," Mateo said, and the words were thin. "I'm trying to keep people alive." Carlo's grin narrowed. "And who decides? You or whoever sticks close to you? Hands off isn't always mercy, boss. Sometimes it's rot." Rot. The image was rot. A system of favors and rules decaying from within because one man, Mateo, had entertained tenderness. Carlo left the words in the air like a seed. Back at the diner, the fracture spread like a stain. Mateo's men, who had once been obedient, began to tilt in their loyalties. They respected Carlo. He had proven reliable in ways Mateo's recent tenderness had not. They took the protection of the diner and reinterpreted it as leverage, proof that Mateo's sphere extended to the little things, and proof that those little things could be used to purchase allegiance. Luca suffered the consequences in small humiliations. A note shoved through the diner door suggesting he'd be useful to a crew in a way that didn't leave room for refusal.
A bottle smashed by the back alley with a message carved into its stopper. Each act was measured to unbalance, not to kill. It was a chessboard economy of fear. Marina watched the pattern and felt the threads of her bargain unravel into something she could not recognize. One night, Vera struck in a way Marina had feared but not expected. She brought the detective to the diner in a plan that smelled like publicity and vengeance. They came with cameras, with a thin-faced reporter hungry for a story that would raise his name, and with a warrant, small and paper-thin, but enough to pull Mateo's operations under suspicion if used cleverly. The detective read aloud the allegations Vera had seeded: unregistered accounts, off-the-book payments, protection rackets. He hinted at witnesses, at vague promises of more. Mateo arrived to find journalists on his threshold and his men tense like drawn wire. Carlo smiled, and the smile was the smile of someone smelling victory. "You were warned," Mateo said when he saw Marina in the doorway, her face drained of color. He took in the cameras and the officers and the wagging tongues of gossip. "You put us on the map." "I didn't do this," Marina said. Her voice was a raw, exposed thing. "I tried to mislead Vera. I gave her nothing that could be used." Vera laughed, a sound like metal. "None of us are fools," she said. "Some of us just have longer memories." Carlo stepped forward like a judge. "You played both sides," he told Mateo with a smile that could split a man's face. "A boss who shelters a woman who feeds informants, that's a man who has lost his way." Mateo looked at him, at the detective, at the lenses trained on his life. He felt something cool and hard settle beneath his ribs, the understanding that leadership in his world was a tissue of appearances as much as it was a ledger. Public scandal could reduce loyalty overnight. Men who preferred certainty liked to be led by a man who did not hesitate. "You have 36 hours, Carlo said softly so that only Mateo could hear. "Fix it, or I do." Fix it how? The question tore through the space between them. Fixing could mean many things: the removal of a problem, the submission of an asset, the reclamation of authority by violence. For Mateo, the options always came at a terrible cost. Either crush Vera into silence and feed her to the ground, or cut the fault line from his life by removing Marina, the woman who had been the unaccounted variable in his ledger. Marina read the room. She saw the calculation in every instrumented face. She had wanted to protect Luca. She had wanted to keep him away from the harsh arithmetic of the city. She had wanted to be clever, and instead she had been naive. When Carlo issued his soft ultimatum, she felt the last of her illusions crumble. "You can't be the only one who decides where I go," she said, voice small and steel bare. "I have a life here. I'm not some property you can hand over." "Your choices have consequences," Carlo murmured. The people behind him murmured their assent. The detective polished his badge like a talisman. Mateo's face was an indecipherable mask. He wanted to say he would not hand her over. He wanted to say he would crush Carlo for even hinting at it. He wanted to tell Marina that his protection would not be a chain to bind her. But the machinery of his world creaked with momentum, and he felt the pull of men who demanded clarity. "I'll take care of Vera," he said finally, voice low. It was not a promise so much as a command. No headlines, no talk, no trials. This ends. Marina's relief was immediate and dangerous. She believed him because she had to. But Carlo's look undercut it. A man who knew how to see whether a promise could survive a war. They moved apart that night the way two tectonic plates rearranged themselves. Small, violent shifts under the surface that would later cause breaking. Mateo walked out into the rain like a man stepping back into a war he had tried to leave behind. Carlo lingered with a smirk that tasted like triumph.
Vera celebrated in small, measured ways, having scored the moral victory of public accusation and the rush of attention. Later, when the cameras left and the empty chairs collected the ghosts of the evening, Marina sat alone at the counter with her hands in her lap. Luca slept on the bench with his jacket pulled over his face. The diner felt suddenly too small for the weight of what had happened. A betrayal, however unintended, had become a cause. Matteo's protection had pulled them into a system that could not keep tenderness safe. She thought of all the nights she had not let herself be touched, of the fortress she had built that she believed would keep love and pain at bay. She had thought withholding meant control. Now she knew it could mean isolation. The knowledge burned. When he came back, hours later or days, depending on how the city counted, the look on his face was not victory. He had done what he promised. Vera's files were shredded by men who did not ask questions. The detective had records quietly rewritten. Carlos' threats were examined as loyalty, not insurrection. The immediate danger receded like a tide, but the aftermath was not tidy. Matteo's solution had been brutal and efficient in ways that left him hollow. For all his actions to stop the press, he had not negotiated the one thing he had promised to respect: Marina's agency. In saving the diner, he had surrendered to the Ledger's insistence that decisions must pass through him. "You could have told me," he said quietly as he stood in the doorway. It was not accusation. It was a question that carried the loneliness of a man used to making the hardest choices alone. "I thought I could stop it without asking for more help," Marina said. Her voice folded with regret and the memory of mistakes. "I'm sorry." "I don't want your apologies," he said. "I want your honesty. If you can't give me that, then we're not partners, Marina. We're a ledger and an asset." She felt the words like a blade. She'd wanted sanctuary, not ownership. She had wanted protection, not a life rearranged by someone else's sense of right. The gulf between those needs yawned wider than either had expected. She stood then, not as a woman admitting defeat, but as someone who recognized the terms of a bargain she hadn't fully consented to. "If being with you means being owned," she said, voice steady though her hands shook, "then I don't want it, not that way." Matteo looked at her, the man who had signed sentences and smoothed brows, and for a second his expression softened into the shape of grief. Then he stepped back and closed the door between them like a verdict. That night, the diner hummed with a different electricity, the low, dangerous static of things once tentatively held that were now fracturing. Carlo moved his pieces. Vera watched the ripples. Luca curled into himself and learned there were costs even when survival was paid for. And Marina sat and counted what she had traded: safety for a time, a piece of her brother's future, the naive hope that one could bargain around a city's appetite for revenge. The fracture did not break them in one dramatic moment. It spread more slowly, an erosion of trust, a series of small, sharp arguments, the way a river cuts a canyon by persistence, not sudden force. Yet, in the quiet hours, both of them felt how near they were to edges neither had meant to approach. Matteo had protected her, certainly, but in doing so, he had also shown her what being protected under his terms cost. Marina had tried to steer a fate with crumbs and ended up feeding a fire. Outside, the city did what it always did. It closed ranks and opened fissures. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and cinnamon and the faint metallic tang of a price paid in fear. Between two people who had begun to mirror one another in strange, unintended ways, an unspoken war smoldered, the war for control, for autonomy, for a tenderness that did not cost the other their soul. Matteo didn't go to war the way his men expected. He didn't call a meeting to assert dominance, didn't send a message in blood. Instead, he walked into the courthouse with the kind of quiet that unsettled the underworld. No entourage, no show of muscle, only a suit buttoned wrong and a face that had stopped pretending it could hold everything. The cameras caught him, of course. The lenses loved contradiction. A man who'd been rumor and sentence reduced to a single visible body was irresistible. Carlo watched from the shadows of his club like a predatory animal that had been promised the kill. Vera watched from the fringes like a general counting the cost of carnage. But Matteo's plan was not about theatricality. It was about taking the wound himself so the people around him could breathe. He met Marina in the alley behind the diner before the world turned its attention. Rain had started, thin and forgiving, and it made the air look like glass. Luca lingered nearby, small and watchful, as if expecting the world to punish him for being loved. Matteo's eyes were tired in a way that made the lines of his face more honest. He had decided, in a way only men who have seen too many endings do, to refuse the ledger's arithmetic. "You can walk away," he said, voice low because it was honest. He had 1,000 ways to protect her, threats and removals and payments, but in the end, the only protection that mattered now was freedom. "We can disappear you and your brother to somewhere they don't track. I can call favors, I can—" "No," Marina interrupted, and the refusal was not fear, but choice. "I didn't come this far to run forever. I came this far so Luca could decide who he would be. I came this far because I wanted a life that wasn't traded." He looked at her then, not with the possessive angle of a man used to ownership, but with the raw exposure of someone who had chosen a different kind of cost. "Then let me choose my cost," he said. "I will not hand you like a bargaining chip. I will not let them take you. But I will also not be the man who owns your life." She studied his face, as if hoping to read a lie. It was a dangerous assent to ask to trust a man built from debts and deeds. But his next words were the part that cracked the last of her defenses. "If taking a fall keeps Carlo from moving in, if it buys you space to live without my shadow on you, then I will take that fall. I will answer for what I am. I will let them have me if they choose, but I will not let them take you." The plan that followed was ugly and necessary. Matteo arranged for a file to surface, documents salted with enough truth to satisfy a hungry public, enough misdirection to ensure the trail would lead to him and not to the people he intended to spare. He fed Carlo a different fear, that public scandal and prosecution would invite worse predators to their streets if the Rinaldi name fractured. He used his men like surgeons use forceps, precise and unromantic, moving pieces so the bloodshed would be his alone. When the raid came, swift, messy, exactly the kind of spectacle Carlo had hoped to force, Matteo stood in the doorway of the diner as if it were a chapel and received the law's hand without flinching. The detective, who had been slick with ambition, now had the moral clarity to cuff a man who'd been both monster and savior. Cameras blared, men whispered. Carlo's face was a pale mask of triumph and fear. Luca tried to move, and Marina held him. "No," she said, not to keep him back, but to keep him from becoming part of the cost. She had learned, finally, that survival couldn't always be bargained for with other lives. Her eyes found Matteo's as officers guided him in. There was no pleading there, only enormous human gratitude and a terrible, honest sorrow. "Don't do this for me," she said, voice cracking with the weight of everything she'd hoped to avoid. "If you're doing this because you think you owe me, don't. I don't want you to be punished so I can have air." "I don't owe you for air," Matteo answered, and leaned close enough that the rain stitched them together for a breath. "I owe you for the part of me that remembered how to be soft. I'll pay with whatever I have left." He touched her then, one motion, slow and reverent. His fingers ghosted the back of her hand, mapping calluses and lines like a prayer. There was no ownership there, no claim. It was a human gesture, small and incandescent, the first consented touch between them. Marina, who had kept herself sealed for months, felt something inside her yield, not to ownership, but to the recognition that someone could be brave on her behalf and still let her be free. When they took him away, Matteo's face was calm. He met Luca's eyes, briefly, and nodded in a way that asked the boy to keep living, to refuse the ledger's hunger. He met Marina's eyes and mouthed, with that dangerous, terrible affection he never let himself speak aloud, "Choose." The aftermath cut through the city like a storm's wake. Carlo's men, deprived of the immediate prize of power, cracked under uncertainty. Some fled, some retooled allegiances, and some found themselves in the crosshairs of a vacuum no one had planned for. Vera cheered from a distance, but the thin public victory she wanted was complicated when the man she'd wanted undone walked into a courtroom with the dignity of someone who had chosen his own ruin. Marina did not run. She stood at the diner window the morning after the arrest and watched the city move like a body that had to keep itself alive. Luca sat beside her, quiet and small, and beginning, perhaps, to imagine a life where he chose rather than was chosen. Days later, when Matteo was allowed a single visitor in a place smelling of bleach and old papers, Marina went. She did not come as someone who would barter away her autonomy. She came as someone who had seen the man's sacrifice and understood its price. They did not speak of deals. They did not make plans to rewrite the world. Matteo had been careful to do the most brutal thing possible, to take consequence on behalf of a code he could not fully live with anymore. He had staked his freedom for the chance that Marina's life would be hers. "You didn't have to," she said, fingers curled around the small grilled window between them. Her voice had edges of pleading, of sorrow, of something tender that had been buried. He smiled in a way that broke him and made him beautiful. "I didn't want to be the kind of man who kept you safe by owning you," he said. "And I couldn't stand the idea that my way of protecting would teach you to fear touch more than freedom. If I have to lose everything to prove that, then I choose to lose it." She reached up, and this time there was no ledger to record it, only two hands meeting through glass, tentative and chosen. He laced his fingers with hers as far as the barrier would allow, and it was a benediction. Not a purchase, not a surrender, but an equal recognition of consequence. "You'll see me again," he said, as if promising himself as her. "When this is over, we decide everything. Together." The redemption was not clean. The courts chewed at Matteo with their slow, grinding teeth. Carlo nursed his bruised pride and circled for influence. Vera kept watching like a hawk. But inside the small, humming life of the diner, a different ledger began to be written, one of choices, not transactions. Marina refused to be an asset. Luca learned the dangerous grace of choosing. Matteo had made the most radical move he could imagine. He surrendered his freedom to protect someone's right to be free. It was sacrifice, and it was claim, not of possession but of responsibility. In the quiet spaces between trials and headlines, their hands found one another again. No longer bargains, but promises murmured like prayers. The city still kept its codes. Men still counted ledgers. Power still whispered its appetites. But some lines had been redrawn. Matteo's fall had been a gift, and Marina's refusal to be owned had a new armor, one forged not from distance but from the courage to let someone love her without buying her silence. Months folded themselves into ordinary rhythms like laundry flapping on a line. Small, stubborn, ordinary. The diner took back its hours. The neon sign buzzed a steady hymn. Marina learned how to inventory not just cups and pastries, but the fragile economies of trust. Who came in and stayed a little longer? Who paid cash without questions? Who left notes of thanks tucked beneath sugar bowls? Luca enrolled in a vocational class and began to keep a small notebook of errands and ambitions. Sometimes he read aloud, voice soft, words that used to sound like rumors in the dark. The neighborhood watched, and in watching, it began, slowly, to respect what had been defended. Matteo became a shape in their lives with new edges, a man reduced by law but not by consequence. Visits at the institution were ritualized, small rebellions against the idea that absence erased responsibility. Marina learned how to carry a thermos of coffee that still tasted like the diner because people need warmth in places that smell of bleach. She sat across from him in a room that hummed with fluorescent light and asked him about things that mattered: the color of his sleep, the names of men he trusted, the way he remembered his wife. He answered with a patience that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with repair. They rebuilt a vocabulary for affection that didn't trade in ownership, a shared silence that sounded like permission, a laugh transmitted across glass, hands that pressed against the barrier for the length of a heartbeat and then withdrew, because even the smallest contact had to be earned anew. Matteo's sacrifice had shifted something in him. Softness no longer felt like an indulgence, but like a duty. And Marina's refusal to be owned hardened into a new power, the right to decide when she would let another close. Outside, Carlo's shadow thinned as men recalculated loyalties. Vera's victories tasted smaller when weighed against a man who would take a fall to protect a life that refused commodification. The city kept its appetite for spectacle, but the people of the block learned to protect one another in quieter ways. A neighbor covering shifts, a woman bringing pies, a kid sweeping the stoop. The diner became a small courthouse of mercy where debts were repaid with kindness. One late spring evening, Marina locked the door and stepped out into air that smelled of jasmine and hot asphalt. Luca walked beside her, taller now, his chin set. They paused at the corner where Matteo had once stood like a tide, and Marina looked at the place he had filled and filled again with presence and absence. "He'll come back," Luca said, like a prayer that had learned to be practical. Marina closed her eyes and let the city fold around her like a shawl. She thought of the first night she'd whispered her secret across the counter, of the distance she'd kept, the bargains she'd made, and the touch, so small, so chosen, that had changed the ledger of both their lives. When she opened her eyes, she saw the diner's light throwing a warm rectangle onto the pavement, an invitation. She smiled, not because danger had ended, but because she had reclaimed something rarer than safety, the authority to accept or refuse love on her own terms. The image held neon, steam, a woman and her brother standing on a corner in a city that still demanded payment, but now the debt had been rewritten. In the window, a silhouette lingered, two hands lifted, palm to glass, promising return.